friends, nice to meet you again. I hope you are healthy, live long, successful and of course always happy. Now this time we discuss influential world figures. It doesn't take long for us to see the story. Enjoy watching.
This is a little story. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by the nickname Lenin, April 22, 1870 to January 21, 1924, was a Russian communist revolutionary, politician, and political theorist. Lenin's name is actually a pseudonym taken from the name of the Lena River in Siberia. He served as head of government of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFS Russia, from 1917 until his death, and also as head of government of the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death. Lenin was politically Marxist and had contributed to his political ideas in Marxist thought known as Leninism. This idea, when combined with Marx's economic theory, is known as Marxism-Leninism. Lenin was born the son of a middle-class family in Simbirsk, Russian Empire. His interest in left-wing revolutionary politics began with the death sentence imposed on an older brother in 1887. He was educated at Kazan State University, but was expelled for his involvement in anti-Tsarist protests, so that in the following years he joined in a radical political movement as a follower of Marxism. In 1893, he moved to St. Petersburg, becoming a senior figure in the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Lenin was later arrested on charges of inciting crowds and exiled for 3 years to Siberia, where he married Nadezhda Krupskaya. After that, he went into exile in Germany, Great Britain, and Switzerland. He only returned to Russia after the February 1917 revolution, which led to the abdication of the Tsar and the coming to power of a provisional government. As the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, he played a major role in launching the October Revolution of 1917 that overthrew Russia's provisional government and founded the Russian RSFS. Soon after, Lenin implemented socialist reforms which included the transfer of property rights to land and buildings to the Soviets or workers' councils. Threats from the German Empire forced Lenin to sign a peace treaty marking Russia's exit from World War I. In 1921, he initiated the New Economic Policy, a system of state capitalism that began the process of industrialization and post-Civil War restoration in Russia. A year later, the Russian RSFS merged with other territories that were also the territory of the Russian Empire to form the Soviet Union with Lenin as head of government. After his death, Marxism-Leninism developed into several new branches of thought such as Stalinism, Trotskyism, and Maoism. Lenin is still a controversial world figure. His detractors gave him the label of dictator because he was considered to have violated many human rights during his time in power, while his supporters opposed this opinion by assuming that Lenin's powers were limited and giving him the title of defender of the workers. Lenin had a major role in the international communist movement and became one of the most influential figures in the world in the 20th century. Lenin's father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, came from a family of peasants. His ethnic background is unclear, and it is possible that he was Russian, Chuvash, Mordvin, or Kalmuk. Studied physics and mathematics at Kazan State University, and then taught at the Penza Institute for Nobility. Ilya married Maria Alexandrovna Blank in mid-1863. Maria was well educated and came from a fairly affluent family, and she was also the daughter of a German-Swedish mother and father of a Russian Jewish doctor who had converted to Christianity. It is possible that Lenin did not know that her mother was half Jewish, and this fact was only discovered by her sister, Anna, after Lenin's death. After marriage, Ilya found a job in Nizhny Novgorod, and was promoted to director of elementary schools in the Simbirsk district 6 years later. 5 years later, he was appointed director of state schools for the province, and during this time he oversaw the establishment of more than 450 schools as part of the government's modernization plan. Thanks to his service, Ilya was awarded the Star of Saint Vladimir, which gave him the status of nobility that could be passed on to his descendants. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in Simbirsk on April 22, 1870 and was baptized 6 days later, as a child, earning him the nickname Volodya, which is the diminutive form of the name Vladimir. He is one of 8 siblings. He has 2 older brothers, namely Anna born in 1864 and Alexander born in 1868, and 3 younger siblings, namely Olga born in 1871, Dmitry born in 1874, and Maria born in 1878. 2 other siblings died in infancy. Ilya was a devout member of the Russian Orthodox Church and baptized his children in the church, although Maria, who was raised in a Lutheran background, did not really care about religion, and this view later influenced her children. His parents were both monarchist and liberal conservative, and they supported the 1861 emancipation reforms imposed by Tsar Alexander II. They avoided radical groups, and there is no evidence that the police ever watched them for subversive thinking. Every summer, they vacation in a big house in Kokoshkino. Among his brothers, Lenin was closest to his sister Olga, whom he often turned to. Lenin was highly competitive and could also be destructive, but he usually admitted his mistakes. He enjoyed sports and spent most of his free time outdoors or playing chess, and he was also an excellent student at his school, the Simbirsk Classical Gymnastics, which conservative and disciplined. In January 1886, when Lenin was only 15 years old, his father died of cerebral hemorrhagia, brain hemorrhage. At that time, Lenin's older brother, Alexander, was studying at the University of St. Petersburg. Alexander was involved in political activities against the absolute monarchy, and he studied banned leftist writings and staged anti-government rallies. He joined the revolutionary group that planned the assassination of Tsar Alexander III, and he was also chosen to make a bomb. Before the attack could be launched, Alexander and his gang were arrested and put on trial, and in May, Alexander was hanged. Despite being emotionally traumatized by the deaths of his father and brother, Lenin continued his education, graduating with a gold medal for his academic achievements, and then decided to major in law at Kazan University. At the end of 1893, Lenin moved to St. Petersburg. There, he worked as an assistant barrister, and at the same time he also obtained a senior post in a Marxist revolutionary group calling themselves the Social Democrats, named after the German Social Democrats Party. Also Marxist. He openly championed Marxism within the socialist movement, and he supported the establishment of revolutionary groups in the industrial centers of Russia. At the end of 1894, he led a circle of Marxist workers, and he also tried to hide his steps because he realized that police spies were trying to infiltrate the movement. In the same year, he began a romantic relationship with Nadezhda Nadia Krupskaya, a school teacher who is also a Marxist. Lenin also wrote a political treatise entitled What Are the Friends of the People, and How They Against Social Democrats. In the treatise, he criticizes the agrarian socialist movement of Narodnik, and is largely based on his experiences in Samara. About 200 copies of this treatise were illegally printed in 1894. Lenin wanted to strengthen relations between the Social Democrats and the Emancipation of Labor, a group of Russian Marxist migrants based in Switzerland. He visited the country to meet with members of the group, namely Plekhanov and Pavel Axelrod. He then went to Paris to meet Marx's nephew, Paul Lafargue, and for researching the history of the Paris Commune of 1871, which he considered the prototype of proletarian rule. Funded by his mother, Lenin stopped at a hot spring in Switzerland and then visited Berlin, where he studied for 6 weeks at the Staatsbibliothek and also briefly met a Marxist activist named Wilhelm Liebknecht. He returned to Russia with a number of banned revolutionary publications, and he traveled to various cities to distribute writings to striking workers. While involved in the process of producing the news sheet Rabishi Delo, Workers' Interests, he became one of the 40 activists arrested in St. Petersburg and charged with sedition. Lenin entered Kazan University in August 1887. There, he joined the Zemlyakestvo, which is a kind of university association representing men from a particular region. Demonstration against the government's policy of banning student associations. The police arrested Lenin and accused him of being the leader of the demonstration. He was expelled from the university and the Ministry of Internal Affairs exiled him to his family's mansion in Kokoshkino. There, he read numerous books and was particularly fond of Nikolai Chernyshevsky's pro-revolutionary novel from 1863 entitled What Will Be Done? After his exile, Lenin settled in Pskov in the early 1900s. There he began raising funds for a newspaper, Iskra or Spark, which was the new organ of the Russian Marxist Party. For the record, at that time this party had changed its name to the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, PBDSR. In July 1900, Lenin left Russia and moved to Western Europe. In Switzerland, he met with other prominent Russian Marxists, and at a conference in Corsair they agreed to publish the newspaper in Munich, and Lenin himself moved to the city in September. The Iskra newspaper containing writings of important European Marxist figures began to be smuggled into Russia, and later became the country's most successful underground publication. He first used the pseudonym Lenin in December 1901, which is believed to have come from the river Lena. She often goes by the fuller pseudonym N. Lenin, and although N meaningless, there was a misunderstanding that the letter was an abbreviation of the word Nikolai. Under that pseudonym, he published the political pamphlet What Will Be Done? In 1902, this pamphlet was the most influential publication he had written up to that time and contained Lenin's thoughts on the need for a vanguard party to lead the proletariat into revolution. Nadia joined Lenin in Munich and became his private secretary. They continued their political struggle, and Lenin himself continued to write for the Iskra newspaper, drafting the PBDSR program, and attacking ideological opponents and outside critics, especially the Socialist Revolutionary Party, a Narodnik group founded in 1901. Although still a Marxist, he accepted Narodnik's view of the revolutionary power of the Russian peasantry, and later put these ideas into a pamphlet in 1903 entitled To the Village Poor. To escape the Bavarian police, Lenin moved to London with the newspaper Iskra. In April 1902, and there he befriended another Russian Marxist, Leon Trotsky. In London, Lenin became ill with erysipelas and was unable to head the Iskra editorial board, so the newspaper moved its base of operations to Geneva. In January 1905, the Bloody Sunday massacre of protesters in St. Petersburg sparked a popular uprising known as the Revolution of 1905. Lenin ordered the Bolsheviks to take a major role in the uprising. He later adopted the slogans of the socialist revolutionaries associated with armed uprising, mass terror, and confiscation of aristocratic lands, so that the Mensheviks accused Lenin of deviating from pure Marxism. On the other hand, Lenin decided that the Bolsheviks should separate completely from the Mensheviks. Many Bolsheviks objected and both groups attended the Third PBDSR Congress, held in London in April 1905. Lenin later presented his ideas in the pamphlet Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, published in August 1905. In that pamphlet, he predicting that the Russian liberal bourgeoisie would be so satisfied by the transition to a constitutional monarchy that they would be seen as betraying the revolution. Instead, he argued that the proletariat should ally with the peasants in order to overthrow the Tsarist regime and establish a temporary revolutionary democratic dictatorship over the proletariat and peasants. He then moved to Krakow in the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, which was a predominantly Polish region of Austro-Hungarian. He used the Jagiellonian University Library to conduct research. During this time, he remained in close contact with the PBDSR, which operated in the Russian Empire, and he tried to convince the Bolsheviks to stop allying with the Mensheviks in the Duma Assembly. Came to visit him, and they discussed the future of non-Russian ethnic groups on the territory of the Russian Empire. Due to the deteriorating health of Lenin and his wife, they moved to the rural town of Bialy Dunajec, and then they went to Bern to treat Nadia's goiter. Lenin was in Galicia when the First World War broke out. During that war, the Russian Empire fought against Austria-Hungary, so Lenin was arrested and detained for his Russian citizenship until he was finally able to explain his anti-Tsarist views. Lenin and his wife returned to Bern, before moving to Zurich in February 1916. Lenin was furious after hearing news that the German Social Democratic Party was supporting the German war effort, in contrast to the Stuttgart Resolution of the Second International, which stated that the socialist parties would oppose the conflict. He attended the Zimmerwald Conference in September 1915 and the Kienthal Conference in April 1916, and called on the socialists to turn the imperialist war into a continent-wide civil war between the proletariat against the bourgeoisie and aristocracy. In July 1916, Lenin's mother died, but she could not attend his funeral. Her death had a profound impact on him, and he became depressed and feared that he would die before he could witness the proletarian revolution with his own eyes. In February 1917, the February Revolution erupted in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd at the start of the First World War after industrial workers protested over food shortages and deteriorating factory conditions. Unrest spread to other parts of Russia, and Tsar Nicholas II finally resigned because he was afraid of being overthrown by force. The Duma took power and established the provisional government and turned the empire into the Russian Republic. Upon hearing the news of the incident, Lenin rejoiced. He decided to return to Russia to lead the Bolsheviks, but he faced difficulties because many roads were closed due to the war. Together with other dissidents, he planned to apply to be allowed to pass through Germany, which was then at war with Russia. The Germans realized that the dissidents would cause trouble in Russia, so they allowed 32 Russian citizens to board a covered train carriage, including Lenin and his wife. The group took a train from Zurich to Sassnitz, and then took a ferry to Trelleborg, Sweden, and from there they headed to Helsinki before finally taking the last train to Petrograd. In August 1917, while Lenin was in Finland, General Lavur Kornilev, the supreme commander of the Russian army, sent troops to Petrograd and attempted a coup d'état of the provisional government. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky appealed to the Petrograd Soviet, including his Bolshevik members, and he also allowed the revolutionaries to deploy workers as part of the Red Guard to defend the city. The coup died down before it could reach the city of Petrograd, but the event allowed the Bolsheviks to return to the stage of open politics. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries who dominated the Petrograd Soviet were worried that the right-wing forces would foment anti-socialist counter-revolutionary measures, so they had pressured the government to normalize relations with the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries themselves had lost a great deal of support because of their association with the provisional government and their totally unpopular policy of continuing the war. The Bolsheviks took advantage of him, and later a pro-Bolshevik Marxist named Trotsky was elected leader of the Petrograd Soviet. In September, the Bolsheviks became the majority group in the Moscow and Petrograd Soviet labor sections. The previous provisional government had planned for the election of members of the Constituent Assembly in November 1917. Despite Lenin's opposition, the Sovnarkom agreed that the elections should be held according to a predetermined schedule. In this election, the Bolsheviks won about a quarter of the vote and were defeated by the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Lenin considered the election did not reflect the will of the people fairly. In addition, he also felt that voters were not given enough time to understand the Bolshevik political program, and that the list of candidates was drawn up before the left-wing Socialist Revolutionaries split from the Socialist Revolutionary Party. However, the newly elected Russian Constituent Assembly began to be convened in Petrograd in January 1918. The Sovnarkom argued that the assembly was counter-revolutionary because they tried to deprive the Soviet assemblies of authority, but the Socialist Revolutionaries and Mensheviks denied this. The Bolsheviks put forward a proposal before the assembly which would deprive the assembly of most of its legal powers. After the assembly rejected the proposal, the Sovnarkom took it as evidence that the assembly was indeed counter-revolutionary, and they dissolved the assembly by force. Lenin rejected calls for a coalition government with other socialist parties, including calls from some Bolshevik members. Although the Sovnarkom refused to form a coalition with the Mensheviks or the Socialist Revolutionaries, in December 1917 they gave 5 cabinet posts to the left-wing Socialist Revolutionaries. The coalition lasted only 4 months until March 1918. The left-wing Socialist Revolutionaries left the government because they did not agree with the Bolshevik approach as to how Russia should stop being involved in the First World War. At the 7th Congress in March 1918, the Bolsheviks changed their official name from Russian Social Democratic Labor Party to Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Russian Communist Party, because Lenin wanted to distance the group from the increasingly reformist German Socialist Democratic Party and also to assert its main goal, namely a communist society. After taking power, Lenin was convinced that his government should withdraw from the First World War by establishing a truce with the Central Powers, namely Germany and Austria-Hungary. Was exhausted by the war, and Lenin himself had promised them peace, and he knew very well that these soldiers and German troops could overthrow his government at any moment and thwart efforts to establish international socialism. On the other hand, other members of the Bolsheviks, especially Bukharin and the communist left, believed that peace with the Central Powers was an act of treason against international socialism, and according to them Russia needed to wage a revolutionary defense war, which they believed would spark a proletarian uprising in Germany. Lenin proposed a 3-month truce in his peace decree in November 1917, which was approved by the Second Soviet Congress and handed over to the governments of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Germans responded well, as for them this was an opportunity to focus on the Western Front and avoid defeat. In November, ceasefire negotiations began at Brest-Litovsk, headquarters of the German High Command on the Eastern Front, During these negotiations, the Russian delegation was led by Trotsky and Adolf Joffe. Meanwhile, the proposed ceasefire until January was agreed. During the negotiations, Germany made it clear that it wanted to defend the territories they had conquered, which included Poland, Lithuania and Kherson, while Russia responded that such action violated the people's right of self-determination. Some members of the Bolsheviks wanted negotiations to be prolonged as much as possible until proletarian revolutions erupted throughout Europe. On January 7, 1918, Trotsky returned from Brest-Litovsk to St. Petersburg with an ultimatum from the Central Powers. Russia had to accept Germany's request for territory, or war would end. Continues.by early 1918, many cities in western Russia were experiencing famine due to food shortages. Lenin blamed the kulaks, or wealthy peasants, and accused them of hoarding the crops they produced to increase prices. In May 1918, he set up an armed detachment that would confiscate grain from the kulaks for distribution in the cities, and in June called for the creation of a committee of poor peasants to assist in its implementation. This policy resulted in chaos and violence, as armed detachments often clashed with peasant groups, which became one of the triggering factors for civil wars. An example of Lenin's views on this matter is the telegram he sent in August 1918 to the Bolsheviks in the Penza Oblast, inviting they quelled a peasant uprising by publicly hanging at least 100 people known as kulaks, rich people, and bloodsuckers. The practice of foreclosure has removed the incentive for farmers to produce more wheat than they can consume, resulting in production slumping. Black markets sprang up and replaced the official economy, so Lenin called for speculators, black marketers, and looters to be shot. The socialist revolutionaries and left socialist revolutionaries condemned the practice of confiscation of grain during the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets in July 1918. After realizing that the Committee of the Poor Peasants was also oppressing non-kulak peasants and giving rise to anti-government sentiments among the peasants, in December 1918, Lenin dismissed it. Lenin repeatedly emphasized why terror and violence were necessary to overthrow the old order and ensure the success of the revolution. Speaking before the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviet Union in November 1917, he declared that the state is an institution created to use violence. Previously, violence was used by some wealthy people against the whole people. Now we want to use violence for the sake of. He also strongly opposed the proposal to abolish the death penalty. At the same time, Lenin was afraid that the anti-Bolshevik forces would overthrow his government, so in December 1917 he ordered the establishment of an emergency commission to combat counter-revolution and sabotage, or what is called the Chaika, the political police led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. Lenin had predicted from the start that the Russian aristocracy and bourgeoisie would oppose his rule, but he believed that the numerical superiority of the minorities coupled with the Bolsheviks' ability to mobilize them would guarantee Bolshevik victory in any conflict. In this regard, he failed to anticipate the strength of the opposition to the government. Bolsheviks in Russia. The Russian Civil War involved not only pro-Bolshevik forces against the anti-Bolshevik White Army, but was also accompanied by ethnic conflicts on Russia's borders and conflicts between the Red and White armies and local peasant groups called the Green Army in various former empires. In addition, historians consider the Civil War to reflect two distinct conflicts, one between supporters of the revolution against those against the counter-revolution, and the other between revolutionary factions hostile to each other. The White Army was founded by former Tsarist military officers, and also included the volunteer army led by Anton Denikin in southern Russia, Alexander Kolchak's forces in Siberia, and Nikolai Yudenika's troops in the newly independent Baltic states. The White Army strengthened after the 35,000 members of the Czech Legion, prisoners of war during the conflict against the Central Powers, turned against the Sovnarkom and allied themselves with the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, Komik, an anti-Bolshevik government founded in Samara. The White Army was also supported by Western governments who saw the Brest-Litovsk Treaty as a betrayal and who were also afraid of the Bolsheviks' calls for world revolution. In 1918, Great Britain, France, the United States, Canada, Italy, and Serbia landed 10,000 troops in Murmansk and captured Kandalaksha. A year later, British, American and Japanese troops also landed in Vladivostok. Western troops soon withdrew from the Civil War, and instead only supported the White Army by providing officers, technicians and weapons, although the Japanese persisted because they saw the conflict as an opportunity to expand their territory within the Communist Party. There was resistance from two factions, namely the Democratic Centralism Group and the Labor Opposition. Both felt that the Russian state was too centralized and bureaucratic. The Labor Opposition, which had ties to the state's official trade unions, also expressed concern that the government was no longer trusted by the Russian working class. They were angered by Trotsky's suggestion that the unions be dissolved. Trotsky considered the unions completely useless in a workers' state, but Lenin disagreed. On this issue, most Bolshevik members supported Lenin's views. To prevent a split, during the 10th Party Congress in February 1921, Lenin imposed a ban on factional activity within the party, and those who violated it were expelled. In the same year, there was the worst famine in Russia since 1891. The famine of 1921 is estimated to have killed about 5 million people. Drought was one of the triggering factors for this disaster, but the government's confiscation policies also contributed to aggravating the situation, and so did Russia's export of large quantities of wheat. To help victims of the famine, the United States government established the American Relief Administration to distribute food, although Lenin was suspicious of the provision of such aid and ordered that this activity be closely monitored. During the famine, Patriarch Tikhon called on the Orthodox churches to sell unnecessary items to help feed the hungry, and this was supported by the government. In February 1922, the Sovnarkom also requested that all valuables belonging to religious institutions be forcibly confiscated and sold. Tikhon opposed the sale of goods used in Holy Communion, and many clergy opposed the attempted confiscation, leading to violence. In 1920 and 1921, resistance to confiscation at the local level sparked anti-Bolshevik peasant uprisings in various parts of Russia, although these uprisings were later suppressed. One of the largest peasant uprisings was the Tambov Rebellion, but this rebellion was also suppressed by the Red Army. In February 1921, the workers went on strike in Petrograd, so the government declared martial law in the city and sent the Red Army to silence the demonstrations. In March, the Kronstadt uprising erupted when the sailors in Kronstadt revolted against the Bolshevik government. They demanded that all socialists be allowed to publish freely, that independent trade unions be given freedom of assembly, and that peasants be allowed to access free markets and their crops not be confiscated. Lenin declared that the rebels had been deceived by the socialist revolutionaries and foreign imperialists and called for a violent retaliation. Under Trotsky's leadership, the Red Army quelled the uprising on March 17. which left thousands dead and the survivors thrown into labor camps. Lenin felt humiliated and shocked when the Bolsheviks threw a party to celebrate Lenin's 50th birthday in April 1920, which was also followed by celebrations in various parts of Russia and the publication of poems and biographies dedicated to him. Between 1920 and 1926, 20 volumes of Lenin's collection of works were published, although parts of his writings were excluded. In 1920, a number of Western figures visited Lenin in Russia. Such figures include writer H. G. Wells and philosopher Bertrand Russell, as well as anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Lenin was also visited by Inessa Armand in the Kremlin, but Armand's health was deteriorating during this time. Lenin sent Armand to a sanatorium in Kislovodsk, North Caucasus, for treatment, but he died there in September 1920 during a cholera epidemic. Moscow, and Lenin visibly mourned his funeral under the Kremlin wall. Lenin became seriously ill in the latter half of 1921. He developed hyperacusis, insomnia, and periodic headaches. At the urging of the Politburo, in July, Lenin left Moscow and stayed for a month at his dacha in Gorky, where he cared for by his wife and sister. Lenin began contemplating suicide, and he asked Krupskaya and Stalin to give him potassium cyanide. 26 doctors were assigned to treat Lenin in his final years. Some of them were from abroad and the wages were very high. Some doctors suspected that his illness was caused by the metal oxidation of the bullets lodged in his body since the assassination attempt in 1918. In April 1922 he was operated on to remove the bullets. The symptoms still persisted after the operation, and Lenin's doctors did not know for sure what caused it. Some suspect that he has neurasthenia, weak nerves, or cerebral arteriosclerosis, although some doctors believe he has syphilis. The hypothesis that Lenin had syphilis is supported by a report from 2004 compiled by a group of neuroscientists, thus implying that the disease may have been deliberately concealed by the government. In May 1922, he suffered his first stroke, leaving him speechless and paralyzed in his right side. By July, Lenin had recovered enough, so that in October, he returned to Moscow. However, in December, he suffered another stroke and had to return to Gorky.
Well, that's a little story. Hopefully it will add knowledge, motivation, and inspiration. Don't forget to continue to follow other interesting stories. Thank you very much for watching. You guys have become donors for humanity. Bye bye.